The moment Elijah Walker stepped onto Flight 729 bound for San Francisco, he felt it. That mix of nerves and wonder that only comes when a 13-year-old boards a plane alone for the first time. His sneakers squeaked faintly against the jet bridge floor. His backpack, slightly frayed at the corners, bounced gently against his back, and his eyes, wide with anticipation, scanned the cabin ahead. He wasn't just flying. He was beginning something. Something important. Elijah clutched his boarding pass tightly. 1A, it read. First class. Window seat. He knew what that meant. The plush seats he'd only glimpsed once from afar. The warm towels, the quiet, the whispered clink of glass. He didn't expect anyone to greet him. He didn't need the fanfare. But he did expect one thing, that his C, booked properly and confirmed by his family, Y, would be his. No questions, no raised eyebrows. Instead, he was met by Heather Milton. Heather had worked for RegalSky Airlines for nearly 16 years. Her uniform was crisp, her blonde hair neatly twisted into a controlled bun, and her posture declared authority. Her smile was the kind that never quite touched her eyes, and her tone, always precise, rarely allowed room for challenge. As Elijah approached 1A and began to stow his backpack, Heather appeared beside him like a shadow. "Excuse me," she said, her voice cutting the air with polite sharpness. "I think you're mistaken, sweetheart. This is a first-class seat." Elijah blinked. "Yes, ma'am. That's my seat." He extended his boarding pass toward her, trying to sound confident, but already the flush of heat was rising in his cheeks. Around them, passengers settling into nearby seats began to glance over. Some subtle, some not so much. Heather didn't take the pass. She just stared. "First class is reserved for premium travelers," she added, her tone turning slightly rigid. "You must have been given the wrong ticket." Elijah hesitated. He looked down at the crisp print on the stub. His mom had printed it for him just that morning before he left their home in Atlanta. His grandfather's assistant had personally arranged everything. "Think it's right. My seat is 1A, he said again, holding it up, this time firmer. Heather finally reached for it, lips pursed. Her eyes scanned the print. She didn't blink. A pause stretched between them, heavy and awkward. Then she murmured almost under her breath, "Humph, first class." It wasn't the words. It was the weight they carried. The suggestion that his presence there, his young black face, hoodie, sneakers, didn't belong in this part of the plane. Elijah knew that look. He'd seen it at stores, at school, once even from a neighbor. It said, "Not you." "I'll need to check with the cabin supervisor," Heather said briskly, as if that settled it. "Wait right here." She turned and walked briskly toward the front galley, leaving Elijah standing beside 1A, his backpack still in his hands, the seat he was promised now surrounded by whispers and raised eyebrows. The man in 1B cleared his throat. "I don't mean to get involved," he said quietly, not meeting Elijah's eyes. "But maybe you should just go ask someone else to help. These seats aren't cheap." Elijah didn't respond. He sat down anyway, carefully, gently, like he wasn't sure if the cushion would push him back out. He placed his backpack at his feet and tried to breathe slowly. But the silence around him wasn't peaceful. It was pressing in, tight and uncomfortable, filled with unspoken assumptions. He looked out the window, pretending to admire the wing, but his reflection stared back, young, brown, unsure. For a boy raised to always be polite, to never cause a scene, to speak when spoken to, this was a nightmare. And the worst part, he had done nothing wrong. Back in the galley, Heather whispered to a colleague, "There's a boy in 1A. He says it's his seat. Hoodie, backpack, alone. 13 at most. Doesn't look right." "Did you check his ticket?" the colleague asked. "I did. It says 1A, but something feels off." "Off?" Heather didn't answer, but the implication hung in the air like turbulence, visible only in the way people shift their weight and avoid asking hard questions. Back in his seat, Elijah felt the sting of stares. Not one adult had stepped in to support him, not even a gentle, "If he has a valid ticket, let him sit." It was like they were waiting for him to prove he was worth that seat, like comfort needed credentials. He remembered what his mom had told him that morning before the car picked him up. Be proud, Eli. Don't shrink for anyone. You belong everywhere your name is on the list. He held on to that thought like a rope, but still the seat beneath him no longer felt soft. It felt conditional. When Heather returned, her expression had changed. There was now something colder in her eyes. I'm going to need you to move to the main cabin, she said firmly. This will all be sorted out later. But, Elijah began. No arguments, she interrupted. You're delaying other passengers. He stood, not because she was right, because he had been raised to be respectful, because he knew that sometimes the louder you speak, the more people cover their ears. As he walked past the first-class passengers, not one person met his gaze. He passed rows of silence, in shame, and his seat, the one printed on his ticket, vanished behind a flimsy curtain. He was 12 rows away when he finally let out the breath he'd been holding. Somewhere high above the clouds was supposed to be a seat just for him, but down here on this plane, the air was already too thin. The aisle felt longer than it had any right to be. As Elijah Walker moved slowly past the rows of first-class seats, he could feel the judgment settling over him like dust. Each step carried the invisible weight of 1,000 assumptions, none of which he had the words or the will to fight in that moment. The plush carpet muted his footsteps, but not the silence. It wasn't the silence of comfort. It was the silence of complicity. He didn't look up. He didn't need to. He could feel them. Pairs of eyes darting toward him, then quickly away, each glance echoing the same unspoken sentiment. You don't belong here. By the time he reached row 24, the middle of the main cabin, Elijah's shoulders had slumped, his backpack felt heavier, and his heart was no longer pounding. It was sinking. The new seat was narrow, the armrests were stiff, there was barely enough room for his knees, and the woman sitting beside him didn't look up when he sat down. She simply shifted away, clutching her designer handbag closer to her side. Elijah didn't blame her. He blamed the space they were all in, the space that told people what to fear and what to ignore, who to comfort and who to question. He sank into the seat and stared forward, eyes blank, spirit bruised. He had dreamed about this flight for weeks. It wasn't just any trip. It was the trip, the one where he'd finally meet the man everyone talked about in lowered voices and respectful tones. Franklin Walker, his grandfather, the man whose name sat on magazine covers and marble plaques, a business mogul, a philanthropist, and the owner of RegalSky Airlines. Elijah had never met him. His mom had never said why, not really. Something about distance, timing, and complicated family ties. But when the invitation came, an envelope thick with embossed lettering and a handwritten note from Franklin himself, Elijah's heart had nearly burst with hope. He had practiced what he would say. Hi, sir. I'm Elijah. It's nice to finally meet you. He had folded and refolded the letter dozens of times. He had even packed a gift, a small wooden plane he'd built himself, tucked into his backpack beneath his sketchbook and peanut butter crackers. But now the backpack sat between his feet like a stranger, and the hope he'd carried so carefully felt crushed under the weight of humiliation. He looked out the window. Nothing but wings, no sky, no escape. Minutes passed, maybe hours. Or maybe it was just his mind slowing time, stretching it, punishing him for not speaking up, for not insisting, for not shouting, "Look at my ticket again!" He reached into his hoodie pocket and pulled out the boarding pass. His name was right there, Elijah Walker. Seat 1A, printed in bold black ink, still real, still valid, still ignored. He felt his throat tighten, not because of the seat, but because of what it said about how people saw him, what they assumed, what they didn't bother to ask. He hadn't cried in public since 3rd grade, but his eyes were burning now, not the hot, dramatic kind, the slow, stingy kind, the kind that shows up when you're trying to hold yourself together in front of strangers who wouldn't care if you fell apart. The flight attendants moved past his row several times. One offered pretzels, another gave a mechanical smile. Heather Milton didn't come back, not to explain, not to check, not even to glance his way. He heard murmurs from a few rows back. Did you see the way she yanked him out of that seat? Well, he looks so young. Probably confused the ticket. No, it said first class. I saw it. Doesn't matter. He didn't look like someone who flies first. Elijah turned away, pressing his forehead to the cold wall of the plane. Maybe if he were invisible, this moment wouldn't count. Maybe if he closed his eyes hard enough, he'd wake up back in his bedroom, his mom telling him it was all just a bad dream. But it wasn't. The worst part? He wasn't even angry. He was tired. Tired of trying to prove he belonged in places that had already made up their minds. Tired of folding into himself so that other people could stay comfortable. Tired of wondering what he did wrong when the only thing he did was show up. He reached for his phone. No signal, of course. But he opened his messages anyway and stared at the last one from his mom. "You've got this, baby. Your grandfather can't wait to meet you. So proud of you. Mom." He closed his eyes, and in that small, dark space behind his eyelids, he imagined his grandfather, tall, commanding, warm-eyed. Maybe he'd laugh when Elijah told him about the seat mix-up. Maybe he'd say, "We're going to fix that right now." Or maybe he'd be disappointed. Not in Elijah, but in the world. In the very airline he had built. That thought was heavier than the rest. Meanwhile, in the front of the plane, Heather stood stiffly near the galley. She had done everything by the book, or so she told herself. She was the lead attendant for this flight. It was her job to maintain order, set the tone, and protect the premium experience. But something gnawed at her. Something about that boy's eyes. Something about how calm he had been. Not defiant, not bratty. Just quiet, too quiet. Still, she brushed the thought aside. Rules were rules. Perception mattered. A mistake in first class could spark complaints, Yelp reviews, and even lawsuits. Right? But beneath that surface confidence, a small unease began to swell. She hadn't scanned his ticket closely. She hadn't asked a single follow-up question. She hadn't considered, even for a second, that she might have been wrong. And now, somewhere in the back of the plane, a boy sat in a seat he didn't deserve. Not because he hadn't paid for better, but because she had made a judgment. And judgments, once spoken aloud, are hard to swallow back down, especially when they start to echo. The plane cruised at 35,000 feet, but for Elijah Walker, it felt like he was sitting beneath the earth. He hadn't moved much, just enough to accept a cup of water from a passing flight attendant, one who didn't look at him when she handed it over. The cup trembled slightly in his hand, not from turbulence but from something deeper, the weight of being erased while fully present. In the seat beside him, the woman with the designer bag eventually loosened her grip and turned to her magazine. Her body language said everything she hadn't voiced aloud. Let's just not make this awkward. But it was awkward, painfully so. Elijah pressed his forehead against the cool plastic near the window again. Outside, the clouds looked soft and untouched. Peaceful even. But inside, he was unraveling. He replayed the scene from earlier on loop. Heather Milton's voice, her clipped tone, the way she had looked him over, not like a mistake had been made, but like she'd seen everything she needed to see in the first 3 seconds and decided that was enough. The image wouldn't go away. Her tapping pen, her furrowed brow, that slight tilt of her head, the kind of people give when they're trying to act civil but believe they're in charge. He didn't even have the energy to be angry. He just felt small. And then his phone buzzed. A faint vibration against the tray table jolted him from his thoughts. They had just passed into a signal zone again. He opened the screen quickly, unsure of what he was hoping for. It was a message from Tara, his grandfather's assistant. "Hey, Elijah, we're tracking your flight. Mr. Walker is very excited. He'll be waiting at the terminal personally. Text if you need anything." Elijah stared at the words for a long moment. The irony of it, how close he was to one of the most powerful people in the airline industry, and yet how powerless he had just been, settled over him like a fog. What would his grandfather say? Would he be furious? Would he be disappointed that Elijah hadn't spoken up more forcefully? Or would he simply nod with that quiet fury Elijah had seen in powerful men on TV, when the smile fades and something behind the eyes tightens like a spring? Meanwhile, up front, Heather tried to focus on her routine tasks, but her mind kept drifting back to the boy. Something wasn't sitting right. There had been no outburst, no complaints, just quiet compliance. And now that she had a moment to breathe, the stillness of it all started to feel dangerous. What if I misread the situation, she thought. The supervisor hadn't said much when she'd reported the seating confusion, just told her to proceed and keep things calm. But even that had sounded unusually clipped. She opened the digital passenger manifest again. Walker, Elijah. Seat 1A. Special notation, Walker family clearance. Her stomach dipped. Walker family. She didn't need to guess. Everyone at RegalSky knew the name Franklin Walker. The owner, the legend, a man who had taken the airline from near bankruptcy 2 decades ago and turned it into one of the most trusted aviation brands in the world. His reputation for high standards and zero tolerance for customer mistreatment was practically company scripture. And now she had moved his grandson to a middle-seating coach. Her fingers hovered over her tablet screen, uncertain whether to flag the incident to the purser or try to fix it herself. But it was too late. The damage had already been done. Back in row 24, Elijah's mind whirled as he scrolled through old messages from his mother. He knew she'd be proud of him for not losing his temper, but he also knew she'd be heartbroken to hear how he was treated. Still, he didn't want to worry her. Not yet. Instead, he wrote back to Tara. Thanks, just had a little seating issue. All good now. A lie, but easier to type than the truth. He closed his eyes. Suddenly, a voice pierced the air. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Elijah only half listened. The usual announcements about cruising altitude, weather conditions, and expected arrival time. But the voice sounded tenser than normal, measured, cautious. He felt the shift before he understood it. It wasn't about airspeed. It was about something else, something brewing, a kind of stillness that people on the ground couldn't feel, but everyone in the cabin could. After the announcement, Heather moved back through the aisle with forced calm. Her footsteps were careful now, and her demeanor had changed. As she approached the coach section, her eyes flickered toward Elijah. She paused for half a second, then kept walking. She had no script for what to do next, and Elijah knew. He knew that something had changed in her eyes. Not remorse, not yet, but fear. Fear that someone important now knew. That this wasn't just about a mistake anymore. It was about consequences. For the first time since boarding, Elijah sat up a little straighter. He didn't feel better. Not exactly, but he felt seen. Not by the people around him, and not by the woman who had dismissed him, but by something deeper. A current is shifting beneath the surface. A correction is beginning to take shape. And with that quiet awareness came the slow return of something fragile but steady. Dignity. It hadn't vanished with the seat in first class. It had simply been forced to wait. Heather Milton stood in the narrow galley, arms folded so tightly her fingertips turned white at the knuckles. The hum of the engines, the muffled clink of ice against plastic cups, the occasional ding of a call button, none of it registered. All she could hear was the name echoing in her head. Walker. The moment she had spotted it on the passenger manifest, the calm she wore like a uniform unraveled. She turned back to her tablet, double-checking the data again, as if the letters might rearrange themselves into something less damning. But there it was. Passenger 1A, Elijah Walker. Clearance code, internal executive priority. And beneath that, in a smaller, almost imperceptible line of script, grandson of Franklin Walker. Heather's breath caught in her throat. She felt the sudden stillness of someone who just stepped onto thin ice. Her throat was dry, her palms damp. The name alone would have been enough. But the title, the man, the owner of the airline? She had pulled his grandson out of a first-class seat and marched him down the aisle like a disruptive passenger, without cause, without a second thought. Oh my God! She clutched the edge of the service card and took a step back, staring at the smooth metal drawers like they might open into another dimension. One where this flight had gone differently. What would happen when they landed? What would be waiting at the gate? What kind of story had already started writing itself without her control? She closed the manifest and adjusted her posture. She needed to act normal, she told herself. Regain composure. But the mask she usually wore felt too heavy now. Her every movement was watched. She knew it. The crew had gone quiet around her. They always did when they sensed something had gone wrong. Because news like this didn't stay quiet. Not on a plane, not in first class, not when the passenger in question carried the most powerful surname in the company's history. Back in row 24, Elijah sat unmoving, not slouched, not shrinking anymore. Still, like someone learning how to hold his own body again after it had been taken from him. He wasn't angry, not visibly, but something had changed. There was a quiet clarity in his gaze as he looked forward, not at anyone in particular, but at something only he could see. The part of him that had wilted earlier under humiliation was now beginning to unfurl, not in defiance, but in realization. This story wasn't just about a seat. It was about what happens when dignity is treated like a luxury, available only to those who look a certain way. He pulled his sketchbook from the side pocket of his backpack and flipped past a few drawings, airplanes mostly, and one he had started weeks ago of a sprawling skyline above a cloud sea. He began to shade in the wing. It was the same view he'd been denied moments ago, from the window seat in 1A. But here, in pencil, he could reclaim it. Around him, the cabin buzzed softly with murmurs. He could tell the story was spreading. He didn't know how. It always did. Maybe someone in first class had recognized the name when the manifest appeared on the crew tablet. Maybe a ground agent had whispered it over the radio. Passengers were talking, quietly, in fragments. That boy, you saw how she pulled him. Didn't she say he had the wrong seat? I heard his grandfather's Franklin Walker. No way. Then why's he back here? Elijah heard it all, not because he was listening, but because when you've been treated like a spectacle, your ears become trained to catch every stray whisper. And just like that, he wasn't invisible anymore. He was visible in the wrong way, not pitied, not quite defended, just scrutinized again, like a walking contradiction. Some passengers glanced toward him and quickly looked away. Others offered small, awkward smiles, late gestures that meant little now. He didn't return them. Instead, he kept sketching. Each line is steadier than the last. Back in the galley, Heather's phone buzzed inside the drawer where crew members kept their items during flights. She stared at it through the plastic panel of the drawer. Buzz, buzz, buzz. The name on the screen, Mark Ellison, Senior Ops Manager. She didn't answer, couldn't. Her body was in the air, but her mind was plummeting fast. The voice in her head that once assured her she was just enforcing policy had gone quiet. All that remained was a growing sense that she had not just mishandled a seating issue, she had triggered something larger, and no one could stop it now. At the back of the cabin, Elijah closed his sketchbook. He looked out the window again. Still no skyline. Still only clouds. But for the first time since he boarded, he wasn't wondering whether he belonged. He was wondering how many others like him had sat quietly in the wrong seat. Not because of a mistake, but because someone decided they didn't look the part. And he promised himself, right then and there, that this wouldn't end when the wheels hit the ground. Something inside him was rising, not like a shout, but like a tide. Heather Milton had always prided herself on being in control. 16 years in the sky had trained her to anticipate every variable. Crying babies, delayed catering, business travelers with too many demands. She knew how to soothe, how to de-escalate, how to redirect tension with a smile. But nothing in her polished playbook prepared her for this. Her phone buzzed again, this time with the unmistakable urgency of someone calling not out of routine, but consequence. Heather hesitated. Then with trembling fingers, she retrieved it from the galley drawer and answered, her voice lower than usual. Milton speaking. The voice on the other end was not familiar. Male, measured, cold. This is Stephen Ames with Corporate Operations. You were just notified via internal alert regarding a passenger on your manifest. Are you aware of the name Elijah Walker? Heather's mouth went dry. Yes, I saw the manifest update, she said slowly. There was a pause, long enough for discomfort to bloom into dread. Then you also understand that he is the grandson of Mr. Franklin Walker, majority shareholder and owner of RegalSky Airlines. I wasn't aware at the time, she stammered. He was alone, dressed casually. I assumed, you assumed, the man repeated, his tone darkening. And now we have a very serious issue. Heather tried to recover. There was a seething confusion, but I'm handling it. You're not, Stephen cut in. From the moment you removed a valid first-class passenger and relocated him without verifying his priority status, this incident ceased being routine. The chairman has already been informed. Do you understand the severity? Heather gripped the edge of the galley counter. Yes, I understand. No, I don't think you do, he continued. This isn't just about a mistake. This is about judgment, optics, public trust. Mr. Walker was notified 5 minutes ago, and he is on his way to the terminal. Heather's pulse thundered in her ears. This wasn't just about one boy. It was about a name, a legacy, a seat that had been promised, and a prejudice that had stripped it away. She ended the call, her hand numb, her face pale beneath the warm cabin lights. Back in row 24, Elijah could feel something had shifted. The silence around him no longer buzzed with awkwardness. It was heavier now, like the entire cabin was waiting for a verdict it couldn't quite name. He didn't know who had made the call or what was being said, but he felt the change in the air. The weight that had been placed on his shoulders was now shifting into hers. He watched Heather from a distance. Her composure was cracking. Her movements were stiff, lips were pressed tight. She avoided eye contact as she walked past his row, pretending to inspect an overhead bin that didn't need checking. And then came the whispers. This time they had a name. Elijah Walker. I heard his grandfather owns the airline. You're kidding. No, someone up front said the flight crew's in trouble. I mean, if it's that Walker. Elijah didn't move. He sat quietly, his hands resting on his sketchbook. But his mind raced. He had never wanted special treatment, never leaned on his grandfather's name like a shield. His mother had taught him to be kind, not entitled, to lead with character, not inheritance. But right now he was glad the truth was out, not for revenge, but for justice. Because now the people who had looked through him would be forced to see him. And not just him. Every other kid who'd ever been judged by what they wore, how they looked, or how quietly they entered the room. He glanced at his phone again. A new message from Tara. Mr. Walker is on the ground, waiting at the terminal. And yes, he's aware. He'll speak with you directly once you land. Elijah read it 3 times. He had only seen pictures of his grandfather, always in suits, always surrounded by people in boardrooms or beside private jets. A man with gravity in his voice and storms in his silence. But the idea that he was waiting on Elijah, personally, was a powerful thing. It made his spine straighten, his chin lift. He wasn't alone anymore. Up front, Heather tried to focus, but everything she touched seemed to rebel. She fumbled a coffee cup, spilled a napkin stack, called the wrong row during trash collection. She was unraveling, and no one was reaching out to stop it. Even her fellow flight attendants had gone quiet. She was on an island now, her professionalism no longer a shield, her control slipping through her fingers like dry sand. Passengers whispered, some stared. But the worst part, no one defended her, because deep down, they had seen it. Her dismissal, her tone, the way she hadn't even asked before moving the boy. It had been a performance of protocol, yes, but one soaked in something colder. Something that now clung to her like smoke. The damage wasn't just done, it was being written, quietly, visibly, into the memory of everyone on board. And 1A, it sat empty, vacant, a throne denied, now glowing with the echo of judgment. Heather glanced at it as she passed once more, her heart lurching. He had belonged there all along, and now because she hadn't believed he did. The skies were starting to rumble. The captain's voice returned just as the plane began its slow descent towards San Francisco International Airport. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing shortly. Please return to your seats, fasten your seatbelts, and ensure all personal items are stowed securely. Flight attendants, prepare the cabin for arrival. The routine announcement masked the undercurrent of tension rippling through the aircraft. It was the kind of tension you couldn't see, but could feel in the stiffened shoulders of the crew, in the quiet glances exchanged between passengers, and most of all, in the silence that surrounded Heather Milton as she moved through first class like a ghost haunting the very space she once commanded. Every step she took echoed with dread. Heather didn't need the manifest anymore. She didn't need the tablet or the whispered updates from crew chat. She knew with every fiber of her being that this flight would not end the way it began. And there, near the back of the aircraft, sat the boy who had undone it all without raising his voice once. Elijah Walker, 13 years old, quiet, polite, soft-spoken, but also heir to the name that now hung over this flight like a storm cloud, ready to burst. He hadn't looked at her again, not once since she ordered him from his rightful seat. That more than anything unnerved her. No tantrum, no confrontation, just the steady weight of his silence, a silence that had allowed everyone else to hear the ugliness in her tone. Heather found herself pausing near seat 24, her eyes flickering toward the boy. He was calm, steady, sketchbook open once more, pencil dancing lightly across the page. His face gave nothing away, but his poise, it rattled her. She opened her mouth, unsure what she was going to say. "Elijah," she began. He looked up, only briefly, and the expression in his eyes stopped her cold. It wasn't anger, it was distance. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. "I just wanted to say," she tried again, her voice faltering under the weight of guilt. "I didn't know who you were." It came out wrong, weak, as if the issue had been mistaken identity, not mistaken humanity. Elijah closed his sketchbook and looked out the window. Heather stood frozen for a second, her face flushing as nearby passengers turned their heads ever so slightly, watching, listening, judging. She stepped away in silence, returning to the galley, where even the coffee carafes seemed to glint with accusation. In the cabin, Elijah exhaled slowly. He hadn't meant to be cruel. That wasn't who he was. But some apologies couldn't be accepted. Not yet. Not when they were made out of fear, not remorse, and certainly not when they still left so much unsaid. As the landing gear deployed with a soft, mechanical hum, Elijah reached down and zipped his backpack. He checked his phone again. No new messages, just the last one from Tara, repeating in his mind, "Mr. Walker is on the ground, waiting at the terminal." He closed his eyes for a moment and pictured it, his grandfather standing at the gate, not in some private lounge or executive suite, but there, among the crowd, waiting. That image gave Elijah something far greater than comfort. It gave him resolve. The plane dipped gently, and the city lights of San Francisco sparkled into view beneath the wings. Elijah looked out at them, his reflection faintly overlaying the landscape. The boy who had boarded the flight hours earlier felt miles away. That boy had clutched his boarding pass like a ticket to possibility. This boy held the memory of injustice like a compass pointing forward. The aircraft touched down with a soft bounce, and a collective exhale filled the cabin. To the average traveler, it was just another routine landing. But to those who had witnessed what unfolded on this flight, especially the ones who had said nothing, it was a reckoning. As the plane taxied toward the terminal, the captain's voice returned. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for flying with RegalSky today. Please remain seated until the seatbelt sign has been turned off. We'll be at the gate shortly. For those connecting to other flights, gate agents will be available to assist you." Heather barely heard it. Her thoughts swirled, looping endlessly over her actions, over what might be waiting at the gate, who might be waiting. She had already received a second message from the executive office. This one had no pleasantries. "Corporate presence confirmed at SFO. Do not attempt to deplane without speaking to the attending representative. Security protocol active." Her heart clenched. They were already here. Back in row 24, Elijah waited patiently, his seatbelt still fastened, his bag held close to his chest. Around him, passengers stirred. Some cast him glances of awkward apology. Others kept their eyes down, guilt flickering briefly across their faces like static. When the seatbelt sign turned off with its signature chime, the cabin erupted into its usual choreography. Bags overhead, jackets tugged from hooks, children complaining about ears popping. But Elijah didn't move. He waited. A few rows up, a woman, probably in her 50s, with kind eyes and a tremble in her voice, paused beside his row as she collected her coat. "I saw what happened," she whispered, eyes brimming with quiet regret. "And I'm sorry. You didn't deserve that." Elijah nodded once softly. "Thank you." It was the first time someone had said the words out loud. It wouldn't be the last. At the front of the plane, Heather stood near the exit, straight-backed, trying to maintain the air of authority she had worn so easily hours ago. But everything had changed, and she knew it. As passengers filed out, she forced a strained smile, though her eyes flicked anxiously toward the glass doors of the jet bridge. Outside, through a thin layer of tinted window, a tall, broad-shouldered man in a tailored navy coat stood motionless. A security badge hung loosely from his lapel. Behind him, two RegalSky executives whispered urgently into earpieces, and beside them stood Franklin Walker. His silver hair caught the overhead lighting like a crown. He wasn't pacing. He wasn't fidgeting. He was waiting, calm, composed, deadly in his silence. And when Heather saw him, her knees nearly gave way. She had dragged a boy down the aisle, and now the skies were answering back. The aircraft door opened with its familiar mechanical hiss, and the cool air from the jet bridge filtered into the cabin like a quiet reminder that the world was waiting, watching. Elijah Walker remained seated, his hands calmly resting atop his sketchbook, even as the rest of the cabin buzzed with movement. Passengers unbuckled, grabbed bags, and squeezed into the narrow aisle, eager to step into their next destination. But Elijah didn't rush. He didn't move at all. Not yet. He knew who was standing beyond that door. And somehow, facing his grandfather felt more daunting than the silence he had endured during the flight. A few passengers paused as they passed him. One murmured, "Take care, young man." Another offered a nod, heavy with unsaid apology, but most simply moved on, eyes avoiding his, pretending that his story wasn't now stitched into the seams of the flight they were exiting. When the last of them had gone, Heather remained at the front of the plane, frozen beside the exit like a statue carved from remorse and dread. Her posture was rigid, but her eyes darted toward the gate, then toward the boy walking slowly down the aisle. Elijah rose, not defiantly, deliberately. He slid his sketchbook into his backpack, zipped it closed, and pulled the straps over his shoulders with the quiet gravity of someone who had endured more than the flight should have asked of him. He took one step, then another. The hum of the idle engine seemed to hush with every footfall. Heather stepped forward. "Elijah." He looked at her, just looked. It was not a glare. There was no raised voice, no dramatic scene, but the calm in his expression was devastating. "I'll wait for my grandfather," he said simply, and that was worse than anything she could have imagined. Not a protest, not a plea, just the unshakable poise of a child who knew the truth was on his side now, and had no interest in debating it with her. Heather stepped back, lips parted as if searching for a defense, an excuse, a thread of dignity. But it was gone. She turned her face away as Elijah stepped off the plane and onto the jet bridge, where time seemed to slow. The world felt brighter outside the plane, not because of the lighting, but the shadows of doubt had finally lifted from his shoulders. Just ahead, Franklin Walker stood like a monument. 6'2", perfectly tailored navy coat, silver gray hair that held the same quiet intensity as his eyes. He did not step forward. He didn't need to. His presence met Elijah like gravity. The two locked eyes. No words were exchanged at first. None were necessary. Then slowly Franklin stepped forward, his voice low, firm, and rich with restrained emotion. "Elijah." Elijah swallowed. "Hi. Grandfather." Franklin studied him for a beat longer. Then without hesitation, he pulled Elijah into a firm, grounding embrace. Not a performative hug, but one that meant something. Something old. Something owed. "I'm glad you're okay," he said. For the first time since boarding that flight, Elijah allowed himself to exhale. Not because the tension had gone, but because someone finally shared the weight of it. "I'm sorry," Elijah whispered, unsure why he even felt the need to say it. But Franklin pulled back and looked him in the eye. "No," he said, voice steady. "They will be the ones apologizing." Behind them, two executives stood like statues, nervous, unsure whether to step forward or stay back. One held a clipboard, The other had an earpiece feeding him frantic updates. Neither dared interrupt the moment. Heather, meanwhile, stood just inside the aircraft door, her breathing shallow. She could see it unfolding, the whispered conversations between executives, the somber expression on the captain's face, the unmistakable disappointment in Franklin Walker's eyes. She was no longer the steward of the cabin. She was the center of a corporate storm. Elijah looked up at his grandfather. Why did it have to be this way? Franklin's jaw tightened. It shouldn't have been, but that's why we're here now. He turned to the executives. Who's handling the internal investigation? He asked, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. We've already begun, Mr. Walker, one of them replied. We're gathering statements and have flagged the crew members' conduct. A full report will be delivered within 48 hours. Franklin didn't blink. It will be delivered within 24 hours. And I want the employee suspended immediately until further review. No PR spin, no delays. Yes, sir. Elijah's gaze drifted back toward the aircraft door, where Heather still stood. Their eyes met for a fleeting moment. This time, her mouth didn't move. No attempt at explanation, no defense. Just the heavy look of a person realizing that power, when misused, eventually turns on its wielder. Franklin placed a hand on Elijah's shoulder. Let's go, he said. And together, they walked away. Not just from the gate, but from the moment that had tried to define Elijah as smaller, lesser, unseen. The hallway ahead stretched long and quiet, lined with polished tile and subtle lighting. As they walked, Elijah didn't feel like a boy anymore. He felt like a story unfolding, one that had begun with a seat, but would end with a reckoning. The reckoning was just beginning. The elevator doors opened to the top floor of RegalSky's West Terminal Operations Center, revealing a corridor dressed in glass, steel, and silence. It was late evening, yet every light in the executive wing blazed as if daylight were still clinging to the walls. A security guard nodded silently as Franklin Walker strode past, his grandson at his side. Elijah kept pace beside his grandfather, his backpack still slung over one shoulder, his fingers tracing the stitched edge of his sketchbook like a lifeline. Every executive they passed stood straighter. No one spoke. They reached a sleek set of mahogany doors at the end of the corridor, RegalSky's executive boardroom. Without pausing, Franklin pushed them open. The room fell into silence. Inside, 11 board members sat at a long, oval-shaped table, some with laptops open, others with pens poised over notepads. All of them turned as the man who built their airline stepped in, not as a figurehead, but as a man on a mission. Elijah, Franklin said quietly, turning to his grandson, take a seat at the head of the table. The words struck like a quiet thunderclap. Elijah hesitated, then walked slowly to the front, where Franklin's nameplate had already been moved aside. He sat down. No one objected. Franklin remained standing. Let me make this clear, he began, his voice even, every syllable deliberate. Yesterday we spoke of revenue forecasts and international expansions. Today we will talk about something far more important, who we are and who we allow ourselves to become. He placed both hands on the table. My grandson, Elijah Walker, was removed from his first-class seat by one of our flight attendants. He was treated with suspicion, dismissed without cause, and relocated without dignity. His only offense? Not fitting the narrow profile that someone decided belongs in first class. The room was still. No one looked away from him. Franklin continued, this isn't just about one employee. This is about the culture we've allowed to take root. It's about policies enforced without compassion, assumptions made without evidence, in leadership that has grown far too comfortable with silence. Several board members shifted uncomfortably. The worst part? He added, leaning forward. You all know this isn't isolated. You've heard the complaints, the surveys, the whispers from customers who felt something, disrespectful, dismissive, or worse, and said nothing because they thought no one would care. He turned his eyes to each of them, one by one. Well, I care, and after today, so will everyone else. A pause, then his tone hardened. I'm ordering a full audit of all in-flight conduct records. Every crew member's interaction logged in the past 5 years will be reviewed. A third-party firm will assess customer complaints and analyze bias indicators within service logs. He walked to the center of the room. There will be mandatory cultural sensitivity and empathy training for all staff, starting with our leadership. No exceptions, no delays. And as for Heather Milton, the flight attendant in question, she is suspended effective immediately pending formal review. Her behavior is unacceptable, and this company will not defend it. A wave of nods moved around the table, some reluctantly, others with grim acknowledgement. Elijah sat still, watching, not just with the eyes of a child, but with the quiet observation of someone whose truth had shifted the room. Franklin's voice dropped lower. But this isn't about revenge. It's about restoration. He looked at Elijah. My grandson will not be defined by what happened on that plane. He will be remembered as the reason we changed. A murmur moved across the room, low but no longer passive. One board member cleared her throat. Mr. Walker, what you're suggesting will take time and— No, Franklin interrupted gently but firmly. It will take will. Time is not the problem. Cowardice is. Another executive raised his hand. Would you consider issuing a public statement? Franklin turned toward the windows where the night city flickered below them. We won't issue a statement, he said. We'll issue a standard. His gaze returned to the table. And that begins tonight. He turned to Elijah. Would you like to say something? Elijah's eyes widened. Me? Franklin nodded. This is your story. They need to hear it. From you. The boardroom went quiet again. Elijah took a breath, stood slowly, and looked at the faces before him. Older, powerful, many of whom had likely never been made to feel out of place in a first-class cabin. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. My name is Elijah Walker, he began, his voice steady, and I was told without words that I didn't belong in the seat my family paid for. I wasn't loud. I didn't make trouble. I just looked wrong to her. And no one stopped it. He paused. I didn't speak up then. But I'm speaking now. Not just for me, but for every kid who gets looked at like they wandered into the wrong part of the world. A silence deeper than the floor beneath them filled the room. I don't want special treatment, he added. I just want fairness, dignity. And for you to make sure this doesn't happen to the next person who looks like me or anyone else who doesn't fit. He sat down. Franklin placed a hand gently on his grandson's shoulder. Around them, the room began to shift, not in noise, but in posture, in faces that had gone from blank to listening, in silence that had gone from protective to reflective. The boy had spoken, and the board had heard. By the time Elijah and Franklin exited the boardroom, the world outside had already begun to stir. In the lobby, RegalSky's corporate staff moved with a strange tension, pretending to go about their business while their eyes followed Elijah like gravity. It wasn't curiosity anymore. It was awareness, recognition, a quiet reckoning of what had just unfolded upstairs. But Elijah didn't flinch under the weight of their stares. He walked beside his grandfather with a steady gait, not out of pride, but out of clarity. The boy who had been dragged from seat 1A hours ago had vanished somewhere over the Rockies. The young man walking through this building now carried not just a story, but a standard. Outside, the San Francisco night was cooler than expected. A company town car waited at the curb. As they stepped inside, Franklin's phone buzzed twice. He glanced at the screen, then handed it silently to Elijah. It was a forwarded news article. Headline: Owner's grandson removed from first class. RegalSky under fire for alleged racial bias. Underneath it, the article quoted a source close to the family and included a grainy photo of Elijah walking through the airport terminal beside his grandfather. I didn't even say anything to the press, Elijah said softly. You didn't have to, Franklin replied. Someone else did the talking for you. The silence did. And he was right. Within hours of their landing, the incident had exploded across social media. A passenger from first class had tweeted what they'd seen: Heather's confrontation, Elijah's removal, the quiet hush that followed. Another user added, he never raised his voice, but her silence after she saw his name said everything. The post had been shared over 80,000 times before sunrise. The hashtag #WagerSeat1A was trending by morning. TV anchors called it a defining moment for RegalSky. Civil rights advocates called it the new Rosa Parks of the air. The public called it what it was: A moment that had pierced the armor of routine discrimination, not with outrage, but with quiet, unbearable dignity. At home in Franklin's residence, a stately, warm estate tucked into a hillside neighborhood just outside Palo Alto, Elijah sat curled in a leather reading chair, his sketchbook open again. But this time, he wasn't drawing airplanes. He was sketching a seat, not an ordinary one. It was bold, almost throne-like, surrounded by clouds. But at its center sat a child, quiet, small, but radiant in stillness. The seat had no name on it, no number, just a simple engraving. I belong here. Franklin watched him from the doorway. You've got something to say, he murmured. When you're ready, you should say it. Elijah looked up. To whom? To everyone. The following morning, RegalSky's PR team begged for a video statement from Elijah, but Franklin refused. He wouldn't let his grandson be used for damage control. Instead, Elijah wrote a letter. It was published on RegalSky's official page, then reposted by news outlets, educators, and influencers nationwide. To those who saw me but didn't speak, to those who treated me like I didn't belong, and to those who know what it feels like to be quietly pushed aside, I'm not angry. I'm awake. And I'm not here to shame you. I'm here to remind you, dignity doesn't live in a seat. It lives in how we treat each other. Let this be the last time someone has to prove they belong. Let's make space, because I promise you, there's enough for all of us. Elijah Walker. The post was shared more than 1.2 million times in 48 hours. Teachers read it aloud in classrooms. Airlines reposted it in their crew lounges. Advocacy groups printed it onto posters. Even competing airline CEOs commented, "We've failed people like Elijah too. It's time to change." Inside RegalSky, the ripple turned into a wave. Flight attendant Heather Milton was officially terminated. But that wasn't the real story. The real story was that RegalSky grounded 5 of its upcoming flights to run emergency training programs for staff, the first such measure of its kind. Media coverage dubbed it the Grounded Awakening. Executives who had quietly sidestepped conversations about bias were now required to attend empathy sessions led by external civil rights educators. New seating policies were drafted and new escalation protocols were implemented. Elijah's quiet humiliation had turned into industry-wide reform. But for Elijah, the change wasn't measured in boardroom memos. It was in the letter from a boy in Detroit who wrote, "Thank you. I'm 14, and I've been pulled out of line at the airport more times than I can count. You made me feel seen." Or the one from a flight attendant in Dallas. "I'm sorry for what happened to you and for what I've allowed to happen in silence. You've changed how I show up in uniform." Each message was a thread in a tapestry Elijah had never intended to weave. And yet, here it was. One evening, while scrolling through new headlines, Elijah turned to his grandfather. "Did you know it would get this big?" Franklin smiled faintly. "I hoped it would, not because of your name, but because of your silence." Elijah frowned. "What do you mean?" "It wasn't the noise that changed them. It was your refusal to shout when you had every right to. That kind of strength, it unsettles people. It teaches them." Elijah looked down at his sketchbook again. The seat was still there. Only now, beside it, he added another figure. This one standing, offering a hand to someone just arriving. A second seat was being built beside it. A new beginning. 3 months had passed since that flight. The headlines had quieted. The hashtags faded from trending. News cycles moved on, just as they always do. But something deeper had remained, woven into the halls of RegalSky, imprinted on the conscience of an industry that had, for far too long, flown above accountability. And at the center of it all was a boy who had once been told, without words, that he didn't belong. Now he stood beside his grandfather at a press conference unlike any the airline had ever held. The RegalSky Auditorium, usually reserved for investor briefings and internal summits, was filled wall to wall with reporters, executives, flight crews, ground staff, and representatives from civil rights groups and aviation unions. Cameras flashed, microphones angled upward, but all eyes remained fixed on the stage. At the center of it, covered in a white silk cloth, stood a curious structure, about the size of an armchair. Franklin Walker stepped to the podium first, dressed not in the tailored suit that had become his uniform, but in a simple dark blazer, open collar, and no tie. His tone was deliberate, measured. 3 months ago, my grandson Elijah Walker boarded a flight operated by the very airline I've spent a lifetime building, and he was removed from his rightful seat, not because of a system error, not because of safety concerns, but because someone looked at him and decided he didn't fit. A murmur rippled through the room, not from surprise, but from the gravity of hearing the truth laid bare by the man at the top. Franklin continued, "That incident forced us to confront something we had avoided for too long. The quiet prejudice embedded not just in our industry, but in our practices, our policies, our blind spots. And it reminded us that real dignity cannot exist in a space that demands people prove they belong." He turned toward Elijah, seated in the front row. Elijah didn't shout. He didn't fight. He sat quietly in the truth, and that silence turned out to be louder than anything I could have said. Applause stirred gently, then grew. Franklin nodded once, then stepped aside. "Elijah," he said softly, "it's your turn." The boy who had once been escorted to a middle seat in row 24 now stepped confidently onto the stage, wearing a navy sweater and a small RegalSky pin his grandfather had given him that morning. He didn't carry notes. He didn't need them. He looked out over the crowd, pilots, passengers, press, and spoke with calm purpose. "I'm not here today because I was treated unfairly," he said. "I'm here because when it happened, the world didn't look away." A hush settled. "And I want to say something to the people who watched it happen in silence. The ones on that plane who didn't speak up, who weren't sure what to say. I forgive you, but I hope you never stay quiet again." He let the words linger, then stepped toward the covered structure behind him. "When I was removed from seat 1A, I thought it meant I didn't belong. But now I realize 1A was just a number. The real seat I needed hadn't been built yet." He reached for the white cloth and slowly pulled it back. Gasps filled the room. Beneath it stood a custom-designed first-class seat, not attached to any aircraft, not lined with gold or screens, but engraved on the headrest was a phrase in clean, bold lettering, "I belong here." On the seat back hung a small silver plaque that read, "This seat is for the one who was overlooked, for the one who was silenced, for the one who came back stronger. Let every flight remember, dignity cannot be denied. It can only be delayed." The room rose to its feet in a standing ovation. This wasn't just a tribute. It was the symbol of a movement. Franklin returned to the microphone, eyes glistening. "Today we announced the launch of the Walker Initiative, an airline industry reform program dedicated to equity, dignity, and inclusion. It will begin with RegalSky, but extend to any airline willing to do the hard work. New training, new leadership standards, new expectations." He turned to Elijah. "And this seat," he said, resting his hand on the back of the monument, "will travel from terminal to terminal, airport to airport. Not to shame, but to remind. Every month it will move. Every passenger who passes it will see those words, 'I belong here,' and know it means them too." The applause was thunderous. Elijah took a step back, letting the sound wash over him. And yet, amid the lights and celebration, he felt something deeper than pride. He felt peace, not because the fight was over, but because it had begun on his terms. That night, back at his grandfather's home, Elijah sat once more at the window seat in the study. The city lights shimmered in the distance like constellations. He opened his sketchbook. This time, he didn't draw a single seat. He drew a row of them, each different, each with a name, a story, a soul. Some tall, some wide, some simple, some elegant, but all of them marked by the same quiet truth. You matter, and no one gets to tell you otherwise. Franklin entered quietly, placing a mug of tea beside Elijah's arm. "You did well today," he said. Elijah smiled faintly. "So did you." They sat in silence, watching the city breathe. And above them, in the air where stories are often forgotten, something new had taken flight. A promise that the skies would never look the same again. Lesson learned. Elijah Walker's journey reminds us that dignity is not a luxury reserved for the powerful. It is a right owed to every human being. This story is not simply about a boy and a seat. It's about the quiet harm caused by assumptions, the weight of silence in the face of injustice, and the courage it takes to stand tall without raising your voice. Elijah didn't shout. He didn't retaliate. He allowed his truth and his grace to speak louder than any accusation. And in doing so, he awakened an industry, inspired a nation, and reminded us all that real change often begins with the quietest person in the room. From this story, we learn that power means nothing if it's not used to protect the vulnerable. Silence can be complicit, but it can also be powerful when it's grounded in truth. Everyone deserves to feel like they belong, whether in a seat, a space, or a society. Let this be a reminder to listen before judging, to act before apologizing, and to use whatever influence we have, not to preserve comfort, but to protect dignity. Because justice doesn't always arrive with noise. Sometimes it walks quietly down an airplane aisle and changes the skies forever.